Great. Well, thank you all for dialing in for the isolation working group meeting for the day. I had some, hey Fabian, I had some different thoughts about what we could potentially talk about today, and I thought that, as you'll see, I didn't put a specific agenda structure for the meeting today, but instead I summarized the conversation that Andrew and I had last week. And through that conversation, we found that there were potentially 5 things that we could be looking at. And I think what I'd like to use the meeting for is getting some comments about the individual items and if we think that these are appropriate or not, and if there are any other things that we think we need to address, because I'd like to get to a position where we can move forward with having things scheduled and raised, rather than continuing to try and dig into different things. I think we need to try and move and start to move forward now. So these are the 5 things that we're putting forward, and yeah, looking for comments, feedbacks, and if there's anything else that we should be considering.
Yeah, first a question. Are they ordered in the order that we think is the most important, or are they just non-sequential anyway?
So the way I had ordered them was the first 2 are existing issues that we already have, that are already raised and present, and we're just not, I'm not exactly sure on how they're groomed or how they are prioritized. It's just sets of issues that we already have. The second thing, the second set of things were about rate limiting, both from Sidekick and the web request limiting. So it was more about grouping them together rather than having rate limiting in different places and existing issues in different places. So they're not ordered in terms of priority.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So just some high-level thoughts on application limits. Since they're not in any order, I'll just go ahead and hit, and then maybe we can talk about if we think what the right order is. For application limits, I put this down in the moment. Basically, this has been the status of this is we found these, oh gosh, about 2 or 3 months ago now. We started work on getting them prioritized. We review them in the availability and performance meeting. Essentially they're prioritized by product. So, the thing that I've been wrestling with is, do we start trying to push on certain areas here, or do we push on product? And that's probably the high level question for that one. Though you could argue that if, we're not running into these at this point, and as long as product's aware and we're making progress on them through the availability and performance, the fact that we're not converging as quickly as maybe we would like, that we might prioritize this lower than other activities.
I think I would tentatively argue that, all of these are, or a lot of them, at least some of them, are like outages waiting to happen. And some of those are quite bad outages, like particularly when, like what Rachel and I were talking about is, like when you get leverage, when you break a limit and that limit goes and pushes a lot of data onto Sidekick and then kind of 10 times is like the application limit. Maybe what we should do is put a little bit more effort into prioritizing, which of these can cause like a P1 outage, which of these can cause like a P2 outage. I just noticed that this webhook endpoints per project issue is back on the agenda, and so maybe we should like not just wait, because I suspect that what will happen is that we'll say these are quietly are being seen, and then we'll have like a big outage, and then it'll be at the top of the agenda again. And like if we just kind of highlight the problematic ones and really push for those, because I don't think they're not shiny things for product to kind of, it's not things that people want to put in the change log or in the blog.
Is there a way we could do that either in staging or somewhere precursor to demonstrate that? Like, should we push this as a testing path?
So the last item on the list of things that Rachel put down was something that we called pathological testing, I think was what we called it. And so what that was like in our QA test suite, at the moment, it's all like things that we would think are like good. And maybe what we should do is create, even for the most important of those limits, like if we say that there's no limit on webhooks, like let's add to the test suite a project that has 1 million webhooks. And basically have that as part of our test suite, the pathological cases, and that'll maybe help us understand which of those like really do bad things to a GitLab instance and which ones we can kind of deal with.
I have a question, maybe a blunt question. So how is this different from the limitation thread in the availability and the performance chat?
It's the same set of issues.
Okay, then sorry, again, a blunt question. Shall we track the same issues in 2 working groups? Or that one is also like a working group?
Yes, I think at the time that we included this in the discussion here, neither Andrew or I were aware of how exactly these were groomed. I knew that there was a working group for availability, but I didn't realize that it was the same set of issues here. And I think what Christopher has written in the agenda document here, that perhaps what this is showing us is that the right step forward to take is about the pathological testing to try and surface which of the most important issues here need to be addressed. But also by looking at that testing, and this isn't something that Christopher said, this is something that I'm adding, that testing might also surface other things that are also important that are further down on this list in terms of the mechanical sympathy issues or rate limiting itself. It seems like the testing will help push out or surface those problems faster.
So the availability and performance isn't a working group. That's a standing meeting. Chun, I'm just using that forum to basically push the issue a little bit with MEC from that perspective. But I think that's the right next step here for this particular one is we got to push priority with product, and the only way that we'll be able to do that is if we demonstrate that we're going to basically fall over, which I like that strategy. It requires a little bit more effort, but I think it's valued as well to figure out what the limit should be. Because, like, for instance, if it turns out the pathological case is an order of magnitude larger, we would potentially not necessarily have to limit ourselves as much as we might just from a theoretical. Though I'm guessing Andrew could probably accurately estimate what the limit should be in most cases.
No, I mean, I think you have to set them and then make sure, like, as part of your QA process, like, it's kind of like what we should have is for every single one of these items where we set a limit, it's also part of that task is to create a pathological case that tests at that limit. And as part of the QA that we happen to do every month, like we test at that limit and make sure that it reaches acceptable like latency and error rate boundaries and everything like that. So, it's almost as part of the application limits work, we are building those test cases.
I also think the strategy of providing a little bit of sort of evidence attached to those will hopefully, convince product that those things are priorities, because obviously there's a million things on everyone's table. But if you can say, like, look, we know that, or we're very certain, that these items here will cause issues, at some point in the near future, I think should be enough to convince product managers to prioritize those if they have the information accessible. Because I think adding new features is one thing, but making sure that installations don't blow up is, I think, also quite important in terms of availability. And
so like, obviously we've got the 50K and the 25K reference architectures at the moment, and I don't know sort of what automated testing is going on that, but like maybe that's presumably, whatever limits we have need to work with those environments. And so, like, is that a good place to do that testing, whatever testing they have on that environment on a per release basis? There's no one from QA here, is there? No, because Ramya couldn't make it.
Yeah, Ram is out sick.
Yeah. But you know the reason why I'm sort of saying that architecture is, I think if we had to do this on an environment that is up for a long time, like staging, you'll probably find that we just take out staging a lot of the time and just kind of destroy staging, and then it'll be down and we'll kind of delay things. And so maybe having it in an environment that we stand up, we do our tests, you know, and Grant Young's done some like really good work around like building that all up, and maybe like a sort of transient environment where we test those limits is a better place.
Yeah, I think we leave it to QA. So I think that's probably good next steps for that one for next week is one, I'll raise it with Mac, and two, if we can get Ramya to comment on us. I think that's a good path for us.
Yeah, that sounds good. With what Fabian was saying in terms of providing more data to product about the specific items, I think with the mechanical sympathy issues, we do already have further data, because these issues are the ones that get raised when they're performing badly in production, and they get raised in that mechanical sympathy alerts channel, and manually converted into issues. Again, I don't think that there's any, well, I'm not sure if these ones are groomed or prioritized in any way, but because they're already performing badly in production, perhaps that could help drive their prioritization as well.
Yeah, I wasn't even aware of these. Which maybe that's a sign of definitely it needs grooming and prioritization.
So, Christopher, normally what I do is if it's very bad, I'll put the infra-dev label on them as well. So if it's something that's really causing, but like there's a whole bunch that are related to the registry, and you know, those I don't think we've infra-dev those, and those could probably do with like a bit more prioritization, because they are really, really slow.
Is that the Docker registry?
That's the Docker registry, yeah. I mean, it's, you know, half the operations in the Docker registry take like 50 seconds. You know, it's really not performance at all.
Okay, so some of them are getting there. Is this because of noisy neighbors, or is this because of just performance issues in the system that we need to address?
It's performance issues, but you know what often happens with them is that somebody's doing something that's pathological, and that impacts everybody else on the system as well. And I think that's kind of why we're talking about that in the context of isolation, because you know it's the kind of extreme cases that impact the entire system.
Okay, do you feel like we should be more aggressive on this one? I do agree that we have more data to provide to the product, but I don't know necessarily. It feels like you've been kind of already triaging these to some level.
I mean, one thing that I can do is I can just raise this in the product meeting. I mean, there's one tonight, maybe next week, and say like, look, these are the issues, and these are actions to be taken from this. Right? I think the question here is really what we expect product to do. You know, because if it's sort of it would be nice if you could take a look at some point. I don't think that's going to happen. If it's very clear, you know, this is the situation, and you know, we believe this is important enough to take a look within the next, you know, like 1 or 2 releases, then I think that's a good message to send. And if it is triaged already with the mechanical, you know, I think that may be a good thing to just bring to attention.
Well, if I look at the distribution across the groups there, which I've provided, the majority of the groups there actually only have 1 issue open. There are then 2 groups that have 2 issues open, and the rest fall into source code or none needing to be assigned into groups. So I think one action is, it would be helpful if those 9 issues can be assigned into groups. And then for the people who have just one item open, perhaps asking them if they could please address those in the next 2 milestones. However, I think for group source code, they have a different kind of problem there because they've got 11 issues that are assigned to them. And I think they might need to be thinking of this in a different, more holistic way for how they're going to address all of those things, because that's not just a quick get it done by the end of the year type of thing if there's 11 of these types of issues open. So I think the first thing is allocating the 9 items into a group, asking the people with one for just one thing, and then figuring out what to do with source code.
Yeah, I guess my question is, I'm wondering if they can be prioritized by severity, I guess in any way.
Are you talking about the application limit ones or the mechanical sympathy ones, Nicholas? Just to be clear.
The mechanical
Yeah.
sympathy issues can be prioritized.
So there are, if you just label, if you search for like P1s, like there's particularly one issue, that API version groups ID, which is a P1 and it's tagged with mechanical sympathy. Those, like if we could focus on the P1s and then the P2s, then like that would be a good start. You know, if we can kind of address those, you know, that would be a really good place to start. A lot of them are not that serious, but certainly that one that's labeled, I know one that's P1, and you know, this has caused us problems on GitLab. So you know, we do have labels, P labels on the most important ones. In fact, there's 3. Yeah. And the groups one is in my mind a very big problem.
Fabian, I like the idea of raising it at the product meeting. In particular, getting feedback of like what would cause product managers to prioritize this higher, or to consider this, or what's the behavior that we want to create. Like as an example, like, you know, if Scott came back and said, I want to see mechanical sympathy issues at under 10 or something like that, then that gives the organization a goal that they have to somehow figure out how to, you know, manage from that perspective. So I think that might be also a good way to potentially push this, because this is a good example where it's unclear to me if they're even aware of it. So maybe it's some socialization from that perspective.
I'd hazard a guess that quite a significant number of PMs is probably not aware. Also just because the organization has grown so much in recent months. So some of the folks who have been around for a while may be aware, but I think I'll put it in the agenda right now for the product meeting later, and I'll just raise it, and also raise it with the questions like, if we think this is important, you know, should we make this a metric or an OKR, or like, how is the way forward? Because I would be equally worried that otherwise it's just not going to gain traction.
Yeah, and it's a little different than limits because this one's a little bit more direct data than theoretical at this point. So I think engineering has a little more work to do on the limit side, whereas this one feels like, you know, product managers should have enough visibility, and if they don't, then we need to figure out how to give them the right visibility, how to make that assessment.
So moving on to the next set of items is concerning rate limiting. The first being Sidekick and the second being the web request limiting. On the Sidekick side, there were 3 issues that were raised there, and Fabian, thank you for updating that one from the comment that was recently put in there, that limiting by paid tier is not what product would be looking to do.
Yeah, I have to admit, I got a little bit lucky. I forgot to do it for a while, or let's say I didn't get to it, right? And then I actually, the feedback I think from product is regarding sort of different queues for paid and unpaid tiers. I don't think is what we would like to see. Option 2, as Christopher has, I think, also identified, is much more preferable. So that's that feedback here. And given that is from Kenny, I feel we can go with that decision.
I think there might even be alternative ways to scope the customers as well, because the first option is saying limit to 2 queues, and the second option is saying limit to the number of customer queues. And perhaps there's an option somewhere in the middle where we're just grouping customers into queues either randomly or even as something as simple as by alphabetical name, just to provide fewer queues than the number of customers, which might be a bit easier to manage. But perhaps there's some other alternatives there in the middle between 2 and n.
So I said it somewhere, I didn't say it on this issue, but I've kind of come around full circle on this, where I think that like we have problems as an organization managing things with like a large surface area, and we struggle to kind of, you know, deal with the things that are you know, the larger the surface area, and I think all organizations are like this, the more we neglect things effectively. And if we go from having 6 priorities to having 18 or 24 or 30 different priority groups, there's more chances of things going wrong. And I kind of feel that you know, what we've done with Sidekick in the last few months has been working really, really well. And we kind of simplified everything. We fixed it by simplifying things, not by kind of diversifying it further. And, you know, if we have a small number of things that we really look after, I think it might be better than, you know, because it might be that we have, you know, customers X, Y, and Z on this Sidekick queue, but actually, you know, Chef stopped running on there for a week, and then our observability went, and nobody realized that the disk had filled up. You know, those kind of, the more surface area we have, the more chances of problems arising. And, you know, I think that if we look after a small set of servers well, everyone will have a better experience. That's kind of where I'm going with that. And you know, especially if we can kind of get the Sidekick queues into Kubernetes, or at least some sort of auto scaling thing, that when we, you know, if we do get a big glut of jobs, we just kind of scale up the Sidekick fleets, and then we scale it back down afterwards. You know, that's where I am personally.
Okay, I will qualify my previous statement then, and I would say I can't answer if having queues partitioned in some way is the right thing to do, right? That's, I don't know if this is the solution to the problem of dealing with Sidekick queues, and I think from your comment, you suggest that that may not be the case. I think if we were to do it, right, I think the suggestion here on that issue was then partitioning by some, you know, like arbitrary grouping is better than partitioning into paid and unpaid, right? I think that's that's what I can say. I'm not saying we should do that at all. You know, that may be a separate discussion.
So in effect, what we do on GitLab.com is we do have arbitrary groupings. And those arbitrary groupings are sort of defined by the latency of the job, like how sensitive it is to being run slowly, or if it needs to be run, you know, immediately. Like when you push a branch, that job needs to run before you can create a merge request. And so that we consider to be a latency sensitive job. And so we have arbitrary distinctions based on like latency sensitivity and whether jobs use a lot of memory or not, and things like that, that we kind of break up the queues in that way. And so, and that is something we do on GitLab.com that the product doesn't really support. You know, GitLab, the product doesn't actually have that functionality. And so I don't know if that kind of ties in with your idea of arbitrary divisions. Fabian.
Oh, I'm not taking any credit for any of these ideas. Right? I'm just saying that for when we discussed this in the last meeting, I think the question was, if we were to do something like that, you know, would we prefer one option over the other? Mm-hmm. Here, you know, I think the you know, like divvying things up is done by customer. What you just described to me sounds like a potentially better way of actually dividing sidekick queues, right? And that is maybe a better suggestion on how to tackle that in the product, right? And I don't know if anybody has anything on their backlog doing that, but I think this could be a recommendation from our end if we feel that is something that we already do on GitLab.com that's not in the product that we should support in the product in order to, but.
So it's referenced in several places, but there's Epic 96 somewhere, and what we're going to be doing with that is taking a lot of what we do on GitLab.com and pushing it back into the product, but maybe not surfacing it so that we can use it ourselves. But it might be something that we want to productize a little bit more at some stage as well.
So is the thought process on this one to just table this idea at this point? Is that just based on the fact that we already have arbitrary groupings and that seems to be sufficient in this area?
Yeah, I think we should definitely, for now, not go to breaking down the groups by customer or tier or anything like that, at least for the moment. I think there's more risk in it than value.
Do you feel like you have the power, for example, if a specific customer's, if there's an attack on a specific customer, do you have the ability to kill all jobs related to that customer based on how it's grouped right now? Or
that is a very good question. The answer is no. I'll just put the link in here. There's a fairly small and seemingly arbitrary issue to fix that. That's that scalability issue 9 that I included there. So the problem at the moment is when we see these gluts of messages, they are like anonymous. We don't know anything about them. And it's a lot of work for us to actually figure out like who they belong to and what they're doing. And all we need to do is drop some extra metadata into the jobs so that we can say, this is the customer, this is the namespace. And then we can say like, go and delete all the jobs for this customer or this spammer more likely. And it's actually quite a small change. Bob is joining the scalability team very soon. And that's the first thing that he's going to work on. And it's not a complicated change, but it's a good question.
So in the interest of time, should we have a brief discussion about the web request limiting? But we do have, I do have a hard stop at the hour.
I think this is the area that we might want to hit on. It feels like this is a definite attack area. If we don't already have request limiting in place, some level of throttling, at least to control customers so that we don't get overwhelmed. So it seems like that's been a definite attack surface that we've seen recently.
So then perhaps an action item for that last one is to raise the issue and continue the discussion on the issue there about what can be done next about that. Would that be all right with everyone?
I'm good with that.
Sounds good.
Then I'll add an action item to the list there to raise an issue for that. We've also already discussed the pathological data in use of testing. And we'll be raising an issue for that and asking Mick for some input and Romeo for her comments as well. But on that note, we are at the hour, and I just wanted to thank you all very much for being involved with this, and I'll send out the notes in the recording as usual. Thank you very much for your time.